All right, today we're talking about Andrew Jackson and democracy and the Indian Removal Act. The thing with why it's connected to democracy with Andrew Jackson is going to be because of the transitioning issues with voting and the kind of the opening up of those questions. The thing with the period when Andrew Jackson becomes president, and really part of the reason that he becomes president has to do with what's generally called mass politics. The term itself is somewhat deceptive, but it's often used as that transition to mass politics, or perhaps the start of that, because of course mass politics implies that that's a larger group of people, and a larger group of people were able to vote for the first time for the presidency, and he had their support. However, it was still exclusive of a lot of people. Women and every other minority were not allowed to vote. Where it opened up into more of a mass politics, or let's say the start of mass politics, was that more white men than ever before were allowed to vote. If you look at what voting was, is that really until the 1820s, most Americans, oops, you get the 1820s there, most Americans were not allowed to vote. And again, you could say that they still were not allowed to after this, but it still was progress forward. The only people that were allowed to vote prior to the 1820s were the wealthy and elite. Voting was based on property rights and taxes. So the idea with this was that the wealthy, and of course you had to be, if we will list what this meant, you had to be a white man. Women, don't get the right to vote till the 1920s, so that's a long ways coming with that, along with, of course, other groups are excluded at this point. And you had to be wealthy, specifically with the ability to have property and enough money on how much you paid for that. And this was very much part of what we call, the founding fathers, the people that set up the Constitution, wanted it this way. If we remember Alexander Hamilton, and what he had said was that, and what he had did was that he intentionally believed, or he believed that people needed to have investment in the United States, in the government, in order to be responsible voters. And so investment to him meant financial. And that had to do with the bonds and purchasing, and so that you had like a stake in the success of America, and therefore then you would have a more vested interest in voting. But even the founding fathers, as they were setting up the Constitution, were concerned about mob voting, essentially the uneducated, the poor, that they connected it back, of course, to the idea that poorer white men, because that's the only group that they were discussing as being able to vote when they were setting this up, would not be able to vote well because they weren't educated enough. And there was this fear that if you allowed the lower classes of white men to vote, that they would not only would they not vote responsibly, but they'd end up putting in someone horrible for president, which is where you got into the Electoral College, and that was like a check, was supposed to be a check for that. So that if by chance you had the mob take over and vote for someone that was ill-suited for president, ideally the Electoral College would kind of step in and prevent that. So that was really how it was connected to, was this idea, this fear of mob rule. And we'll see when Andrew Jackson, too many A names, Andrew Jackson gets elected in, that some of the kind of old guard, if you will, saw this as the beginning of the end. Of this is what we feared would happen, that this is the mob rule kind of sentiment. So why did it change? What allowed for this transition to allow white men without significant wealth to start voting? Well, one of the things that happens is that you have westward expansion. And westward expansion came with these territories looking to bring people in. They wanted people to come live in their territory, right? If you're going to expand and eventually become into a statehood, you need a certain number of people. And so they wanted people to come live there. Well, one of the ways, incentives, if you will, was that they opened up the vote, the state vote, or territory vote, but that became state vote, to most white men. And that was a huge change in options, in that the majority of white men could now participate in voting. This leads to other states, right? So the other states became concerned that this was drawing people away, so they dropped the property requirements. So it really was a reaction to westward expansion. And what's interesting with that is that the West is going to be the first to open up for women voting as well, and for the exact same reason. So they dropped this property requirements to much lower. That's why there wasn't quite all white men. It was much easier. You had more opportunity to vote as a poor white man in the West. But because of the West, these other states said, okay, we'll lower the property requirements. Don't move west. Please don't move west, kind of thing. And so that was ultimately, and they also lowered the tax paying requirements as well. And this ultimately begins to lead to virtually all of the states opening up the ability for white men to vote. States opened for white male voting. So again, that's key, right, in the sense that it was a large percentage of transition to voting. It still excluded a lot of people. So again, while it's often labeled mass politics, I just want that caveat in there to be clear that it was mass politics for white men. This was the start of that. It does lead, again, to other opportunities, and it leads to, we see with the West opening up for women, and that's eventually going to push for other voting opportunities and pushing for suffrage, because others are going to be like, well, what about us? But at this point, it's still fairly limited, but far larger than what it had ever been before, because it was very elitist before 1820. It was very, very limited. So I think that's the kind of key. And it really, Andrew Jackson owes his presidency this first time around to that new group of people being able to vote. And that will kind of explain some of the reaction to, well, let's talk about that, and then we'll talk about Rhode Island, who was the exclusion to this, where they refused to do so. So what happens is that Andrew Jackson then is voted into as president, and he we'll put it here. So the inauguration of Andrew Jackson. there was definitely a lot of fervor around Andrew Jackson being elected because, again, for the first time you had these people that hadn't been able to vote that now were able to. He was seen as the common man, or at least the interest of. And he didn't dissuade that he was one of the people. He was Andrew Jackson was crazy. He was by far he was brash and what many people would have considered vulgar. He was rough, quick to temper, and probably a little crazy. He got into so many duels, fights and duels. He did also promote an anti-elite sentiment for the government. So this was all stuff that people were kind of really desiring, right? Especially the people, not the elite, but all the people who were new to being able to vote. All of these white men that had been excluded from voting they obviously sympathized and connected to this idea of the elite, running the government and excluding them. And then you have Andrew Jackson that comes in and says, I'm one of the common men. He was wealthy. He wasn't a common man, but he fit into that kind of mentality. His language, his behaviors definitely fit more with that. He didn't have the same kind of snooty air of eliteness that some of the others did. So that certainly appealed to people. So the fights and duels. He got into lots of fights over a variety of things, and he dueled several times. And the stories, at least with these duels, and how accurate it is from the exact events of what happened, who knows. But what the reputation he got with these duels is that he was pretty crazy. People didn't want to go up to him in a duel. There was one duel where he was, they got ready to shoot, and they turned around, and the other guy shot first, and Andrew Jackson hadn't shot yet, and he hit him, right? And oftentimes, if someone was shot, that ended the duel. But Andrew Jackson just stood there, and then calmly and slowly aimed his gun, which had to scare the living crap out of the person that was like, oh crap, I just shot him, I hit him, and now I have to stand here while he takes aim at me. He beat people with his cane. He attacked people. He had multiple duels. And this is but a time there were duels. Alexander Hamilton had died by a duel. But by the time of Andrew Jackson, duels were on their way out they weren't even fully acceptable when Alexander Hamilton did them, right? They had to go to New Jersey because they were illegal in New York and other areas. But so it wasn't even like dueling was fully accepted back when Alexander Hamilton was there, but it definitely was more on the way out. And yet he still very much was that sentiment of dueling and fighting. But this idea of that he was willing to take on and physically attack whoever pissed him off. And then of course you get these rumors spread about the duel, where and we know that he had at least two different wounds, maybe three, but at least two, where parts of the bullet remained in him from different duels. So he was hit more than once in a duel, and yet didn't die, and kept dueling. So it was definitely this that sense of don't mess with Jackson, because good luck with that. And that was all for many people. They looked on Jackson with kind of disdain for that. Well, but for the common people, for all of these new white men that hadn't been able to vote before, that were of the lower classes, he was kind of like their hero in a sense. And so what happens on his inauguration is that thousands of Americans that were farmers, laborers, mostly of the lower class, came to the Capitol to watch his inauguration. And it was the most attended at this time, right? There was extreme interest to participate, to feel a part of that. And that was something that was not common before or expected. And they didn't just come and watch him get sworn into office. They also decided to attend the White House. Let's just say the whole Secret Service security thing wasn't a big thing back then. And the crowds ended up swarming the White House, wanting to attend and I guess see the White House. And so much so that, eventually they set up beer and food outside of the White House to get people out because they would not leave. But people wanted to shake Andrew Jackson's hand and congratulate him, right? And I think that shows how much of an excitement and identification people had with Andrew Jackson, right? That they felt connected, that, we were responsible, like I had a part in that. He's my president, which it is. Voting is a powerful thing in that regard. Right. But what happened is, so not only did they want to shake his hand, but they ended up it was overflow of people in the White House. And because of the chaos, it ended up, they destroyed the carpets. The carpets were ruined. There was different furniture was also broken, and general, let's just call it trashing of the White House. Most of it was not like intentional, but rather just because of the sheer number of people. But they did get a little bit rowdy, and there definitely was some stuff written about how people broke things. But most of it was just, the carpet's ruined. Remember, not everything was paved back then. It was still kind of seen as a dump in many cases. It was nicer than when it, you had Adams and Jefferson, but ultimately there you still had a lot of roads that weren't paved. So people were trampling in muddy footprints all over the place. So that part's not intentional. The furniture was just overburdened. But there was some of that as well. And literally they had to bring out beer and snacks and put it out on the White House lawn to get people to get out of the White House, which you definitely wouldn't have, you can't do now. Yeah, people are not allowed to just waltz into the White House. This might have been the first, maybe we shouldn't just let people come in kind of thing. But what I think is interesting with kind of showing the dichotomy between kind of that old guard and then Andrew Jackson and the people who voted for him is that his closest advisors for Andrew Jackson called it a proud day for the people. Right? They said that they saw this scene and they thought it was a good thing, right? The old guard, or the more elite people, senators and politicians, we'll say older politicians, they looked at the scene and they called it the reign of King Mob. And they didn't mean it in a positive light. It was that fear that there really was this fear that the mob would ruin, that there would be mob rule. Let's say fear of mob rule and destruction of the politics. I mean, I don't think they went so far as to say that it was going to be the end of America, but there definitely was this fear of this change, and they looked on the scene with horror. And we have lots of written records from that as well. So you had one group saying, you know, this was the greatest thing ever, and then you had others that looked on it in horror, going, "Oh, what have we become?" And so it is going to show that tension for a while, which then gets kind of transferred on to other people once you know, white voting becomes acceptable for all white men. Eventually, that same kind of mentality gets looked on for like women or for the former slaves and not black women but black men, and what have we become, or what have we become? It kind of like it repeats itself each time there were more people that were added into being able to vote, and so I guess they, you know, fully learn things from that. It isn't going to be the end of the politics as we know it, or end of America, maybe just the end of what they had come to expect and what they were wanting with the elite voting. But so Andrew Jackson did represent to some this idea of the debasement of American politics, that this is exactly what we feared. Of course, it didn't come to that, and Andrew Jackson wasn't, again, he wasn't some uneducated individual that didn't have any clue what was going on. He just presented himself as a common man, and definitely, again, was more brash and you could argue vulgar comparatively as they would have seen it. And definitely, like I said, the fighting in duels was seen as undignified by a lot of the wealthier people by this point, for sure. And so he didn't fit the mold by any means, and then the people, white men, embraced him as their own. Okay, so with this though, oh, let me show you pictures of that real quick, and then we'll look at the Dorr Rebellion. So here we have, here's Andrew Jackson, and just to get an idea, here there's two scenes from the inauguration of Andrew Jackson. This one just shows everyone kind of on the White House lawn, but coming and going, right? This wasn't the normal scene of a president being inaugurated. You had this was abnormal, and then here. This is a good scene with just showing the various kind of chaos of the situation. Look how crowded, like every aspect of inside was crowded. There's you know, garbage and stuff on the floor. They're all crowding around, various people drinking and laughing, eating, partying, and this was seen as, and I think it's the idea here of showing, it was meant to showcase, like I said, that you have different people in different types of clothing as far as to indicate their wealth, and this would have been seen, and this would have been crazy, like to have the White House completely packed like this was not something that happened, and it definitely did, it cost a lot of money in restoring the inside of the White House. So right, we see this transition with politics, but there was one state. Yeah, we're still in mass politics here. So C, there was one state that resisted that transition, which was Rhode Island. So Rhode Island had continued to prohibit more than half of the white adult male population from voting. So while all these other states continue to prohibit, let's see, more than half of white men voting. So while all the other states had opened up, right, you still had Rhode Island here that was being far more restrictive in allowing white men to vote. And not only that, but into the by 1830, you had the conservative government, because it was much more of a conservative government than pretty much everywhere else in terms of their view of voting, continued to block reform for voting. So they didn't, like, we're going to see this is going to be, we'll put the Dorr Rebellion. This is the rebellion that takes place is going to be connected to that. And they didn't immediately start rebelling against it. But there was attempt to push reform through, to try to get it changed through the government. And the government continued to block that. So what happens in 1840 is that a lawyer named Thomas Dorr, thus the Dorr Rebellion, and a group of his followers created the People's Party. And the People's Party, what they did is they held a convention, and they set up a constitution. So it was basically a constitutional convention, and submitted it to popular vote in Rhode Island. So they basically said, well, if the government is not going to give us the right to vote, we'll just create our own state government. So yeah, they had a whole constitutional convention, and then they sent it to the people to vote, and it was overwhelmingly approved. Not surprisingly, because like I said, by this point now you have around 20 years of men being able to vote in other states. And so if you're sending it then to white men that can't have the vote, they're gonna want to vote. With this, you have what happens. Actually, let's put it under here for this, right? So it was overwhelmingly approved. The reaction to it was that the original legislature, so the Rhode Island government, rejected it, not surprisingly, and created, essentially set up their own new constitution and proposal. So they rejected it. They submitted a new constitution. So they basically said, well, we don't like your constitution, so we're going to set up our own, and sent it to the voters, and it was defeated narrowly. So the voters, and then defeated. What happens from this is that the Dorrites, as they became called, began to set up a new government under the new constitution. So the Dorrites set up new government, and Thomas Dorr was made the governor. What happens with this is that essentially both sides, while they were doing this, both sides, the Rhode Island government and the Dorrites, claimed legitimacy. So they both claimed that they had the right to do this, and the other side did not. Worse, the government, the Rhode Island government, we'll just say old government, or original government, the government that's still technically in power. So even though they tried to set up a new government and they were setting him up as governor, like they hadn't taken control of the capital yet. And the old government that was still in the capital, the state proclaimed, they made Dorr and his followers and the government that they were setting up as rebels, and began to imprison them and put them in prison. So instead of like making an agreement or trying to work with them, they just labeled them as traitors, basically. They called them rebels. They also called them traitors, and threw them in prison. Not surprisingly, this meant that the Dorrites actually made an attempt to capture the state, as well as raid an armory, so that they had the weapons to hold it. Capture state. And this becomes the rebellion, right? Specifically with the failed arsenal. They don't capture the arsenal. They don't end up with the weapons. And we'll say, oops, it moved as I was writing. And failed. With this, one of the things is then they do get labeled traitors. However, what it ultimately did is it did make the Rhode Island government expand voting rights. So they ended up getting what they wanted out of it. Not everything, obviously, because their constitution and their structure wasn't. It included more options and differences than the Rhode Island Constitution. But the original conflict and why, like, Thomas Dorr set this up with the People's Party was because of them not getting the right to vote. So that did come about. And so you do, by the end of the Dorr Rebellion, you have a much larger base of people who can vote in the United States. And I think the Dorr Rebellion also made it clear to everyone, even though they had mostly expanded everywhere else by then, that they weren't going to be able to deny white men the right to vote. Obviously, democratization in the sense of voting was far from complete, but you do have the changes that were starting to allow, like I said, at least more people to vote, and the popular vote became more important. By 1828, electors were chosen by popular vote, which is important because we'll keep this under here because it is a consequence and change from this. Before that, from the Electoral College, you had they were not chosen by popular vote, and so the thing with that is then you can the elite, the wealthy individuals that were part of the politicians could have selected who they wanted to represent the vote for president. Right, they could have picked and controlled the narrative with that. But if you have more white men being able to vote, again, more importantly, they're starting to include the lower classes. It's still only men, but they're starting to include the lower classes. And now, popular vote is choosing the electors in every state but South Carolina. We'll say except South Carolina. Then that means that the popular vote is going to have more sway in what the electors are choosing for president. And you see a huge percentage of white men that were voting. So in 1824, just to give you an idea of the percentage change, right? You had less than 24% less than 27% of white men had voted. And that was because of property rights and wealth requirements. By the election of 1828, you had around 58%. Again, these are all white men percentages. And then by 1840, you had 80%. So it still is important, even though it's still exclusionary of a lot of people. Like this number here just showcases how many more people. You have a significant difference in who's going to be elected as president and who's going to be elected in different aspects of politics when you have 80% of white men voting versus less than 27% prior to that, right? That creates a drastic shift in that kind of power that the popular vote is going to have, right? The popular vote isn't going to mean much at 27%. It ultimately is going to be the electors that are going to have more of a say. But when you have 80% voting, that gives more power to the popular vote. So I think that's kind of the key in mass politics, where that term is going with it, is that it created more of a say and power within the popular vote. Of course, like I said, our government still has limitations with what the popular vote where it counts and where it doesn't. But the more popular votes you have, this is why it's so important for people to vote even today. And we talked about this in the previous lecture. Like your local elections are far more important because your popular vote is one for one counting for things. Your city councils, your local legislature, the House of Representatives, like those things, your popular vote matters completely. And ultimately, as I had said before, local elections, like your city council, people ignore it. The city council has a lot of power and can do a lot of good changes and things and policies and rules locally. And so who you have in there is important. Likewise, those for state legislation is also super important. And that often kind of gets overlooked for the presidential election, which is not just by popular vote, as we've seen. But the more people who vote, even in a presidential election, the more you have people, the higher popular vote, the more pressure it puts on the Electoral College to go in that direction and follow the popular vote. So it still matters. It's just not a direct one-to-one. And thus why this number of having 80% makes a difference compared to 27%. Because even though you have the Electoral College making decisions, 80% of people voting, if you have a massive support for one president, it's difficult for the Electoral College to vote against that. Versus if it's really close, the Electoral College tends to have a lot more sway and choice of what they do. So that, like I said, just to keep that in mind is the importance of that. So what we have, the Jackson's mentality and view, like I said, he was supported by the common man and certainly embraced this idea of what he called equal protection and equal benefits. That for white men, of course, but that it shouldn't favor one region or class over another. He definitely was that anti kind of elite system. And what's interesting with that is that he definitely believed in state power. He did feel like the federal government shouldn't overextend its power on the states, which is interesting considering that what happens with John Calhoun, and the nullification crisis. So let's put Calhoun and nullification crisis. So his belief, let's put that, he believed, let's put Jackson just so it's clear that's not Calhoun. Jackson believed in reduction of federal power and states' rights. Now, he wasn't advocating like a return to the Articles of Confederation. He just was definitely a belief that the federal government concentrated power in Washington would lead to few opportunities for the common man. That was his belief, right? That's because it was, he, in his mind, it was so connected to the elite that if you kept all the power in Washington, then it would naturally exclude the average white man. However, he did strongly believe in the preservation of the Union. And this is going to shape his reaction and decision to the nullification crisis. Preservation of the Union. So there's that kind of weird mix of, yes, states should have a lot of rights, the federal government should have a reduction in power, but don't try to leave. It's essentially going to be the issue. So John Calhoun, he oops. If we look at what happens and how he gets involved in this, he was the vice president with Andrew Jackson, and he had run for vice president on the Andrew Jackson ticket, and he had hopes of one day being president himself, and this certainly shapes what he does next. So he had supported a tariff. He was a supportive of tariffs in a couple different tariffs, but he's supportive of a tariff that by 1820 had unfairly been connected to South Carolina's economic decline. So by 1920, tariff was, we'll say, incorrectly connected to South Carolina's economic problems. And because he had political interest in looking to trying to become president, he didn't want to take the blame for South Carolina's economic decline. And because of what they started doing is that they said, oh, well, Calhoun had supported this tariff, and this is why we are now, our economy is in struggle. The real reason was ultimately because was overuse of farmland, and they were competing with new fertile lands in the Southwest. But it was easier to blame the tariff, and so they looked to who supported the tariff. Oh, John Calhoun has been supporting these tariffs, and the tariffs are cutting their taxes on our goods, right? And this is why we're having economic issues. So because he wanted to continue a political career, and he was looking to hope to be president one day, his response was to support this idea of nullification. Because there were talks of secession. And of course you can't support that if you're going to become president. And I mean, South Carolina is going to learn from this that you can't secede by yourself, which will be important for when it gets to the Civil War. But what happens is that he was trying to figure out a way to, find a way that would not blame him anymore, and also show himself as a strong supporter of South Carolina because he would need their votes, but also, of course, have a more moderate approach in remaining in the Union. And so what he argues is this idea of nullification, where he says, since the federal government was a creation of the states, right? That it's all of the states together that creates and gives power to the federal government. The states, rather than the courts or Congress, okay, so the states, rather than the courts or Congress, were the final arbiters of constitutionality of federal law. So rather than the Supreme Court or Congress deciding what was constitutional or not, it really was up to the states to make that final decision, because they were the ones that gave power to the federal government. I mean, it was a workaround argument for the whole thing, but that was an attempt to stop discussion of secession, but also tackle the tariffs in order to try to repeal them. Okay, so with this, his argument, because it's a little convoluted, right? So with this, his argument was that if the states are the final arbiters of constitutionality of federal law, if a state determines that Congress has passed an unconstitutional law, so if a state determines that, right, and this is going to bypass the Supreme Court altogether, because they weren't going to vote for the way that he wanted. This is the workaround for, well, if we can't get the Supreme Court to vote the way we want, then how do we circumvent them altogether? So if a state determines that Congress has passed an unconstitutional law, then what it could do is it could hold a special convention. And what the special convention would do is declare, if they decided, the law, whatever the federal law was, null and void. Because within that state, right? This was state specific. So the state wouldn't be deciding a federal law for other states. It would only be deciding it for that state. So again, how this works, right? Federal government was a creation of the states. The federal government only had power because the states gave it power. The states, therefore, then, rather than the courts or Congress, such as the Supreme Court, were the final arbiters of what was constitutional or not. If a state determines that Congress has passed a law that they deem unconstitutional, instead of going to the Supreme Court, the states hold a convention and they decide. If they decide that it violates the Constitution, they can vote that federal law null and void for that specific state. That's what that's saying. And this was popular and began to spread in increasing amounts in South Carolina. Calhoun kind of hoped that the nullification theory would not actually ever be used, but would eventually pressure the federal government to reduce the tariff rates and also get him off the hook for being blamed for supporting the tariffs. So it's interesting to look at why nullification came into being, right? Is South Carolina didn't like the federal tariffs and the taxes that they were having to pay. And because Calhoun had different, continuing political interest, he comes up with this kind of roundabout theory of how states have the power to decide constitutional law, whether a law is constitutional or not by the federal government, and that each state, I mean, imagine this would be so much chaos if this actually was allowed, that basically every state could make federal law null and void if they didn't like it. I mean, technically it was supposed to be based on the Constitution, but the reality is that you would just do this. They would just be voting whether they wanted the law or not really arguing, because it wasn't judges making a decision. They bypassed the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is were the people who decided after the midnight appointments. They made themselves the arbiters of what was constitutional or not. And so, nope, they're not qualified to do that. Each state has the power to do that instead. It would create chaos because every state would have different federal laws they would actually vote or not vote to do. So that he didn't. So this was gaining popularity. Like I said, he ultimately had hoped that it wouldn't be used because what would happen is the federal government, not wanting to have a crisis on their hands, would just agree to reduce the tariffs so that they wouldn't start trying to do this. What's interesting with this is all of this kind of decision and the nullification crisis that comes out of this. This isn't the crisis yet. That's just the setup for what nullification theory was connected to his political ambitions in many ways. So you had Calhoun ends up having a falling out with Jackson. And this falling out is going to lead to Martin Van Buren becoming closer to Jackson and ultimately becoming president. So Martin Van Buren was also politically ambitious around this time. And he had helped Jackson in the election and ended up getting elected as governor himself. Jackson relied on advisors, informal advisors, which was abnormal for the time. And this was called, it ended up being called the Kitchen Cabinet. And Van Buren was a member, as well as Calhoun and others. So this was the key being, right, that this was an informal group of advisors. There were some that were official, some that were not. And again, that was, you only usually had official advisors in government positions. And Jackson brought in people he trusted as advisors, whether they were official or not. And this does give all the cabinet members, the kitchen cabinet members, a lot of influence with the president. But how this had a falling out with Jackson for Calhoun was that Peggy O'Neill was the daughter of a Washington tavern keeper, who Jackson and John Eaton, they visited this tavern frequently. And what happens is that when Eaton's wife dies, he ends up marrying Peggy O'Neill. Well, he didn't wait that long after his wife died to marry. We'll say after his wife died. After his wife died, he didn't wait very long. So not surprisingly, rumors started spreading that he had had an affair with Peggy O'Neill. And why this matters is because he had an affair, right? Was that Eaton ends up being named after he married Peggy O'Neill. He was named Secretary of War. And because of this, he got put into the kitchen cabinet, right? He was part of that inner, he became part of inner circle with the president, which included Martin Van Buren and John Calhoun. Well, within this inner circle of this kitchen cabinet, the wives had their kind of their own wives club. Wives had their own circle. if nothing else, for just social aspects, right? Well, what happens is that Mrs. Calhoun refuses to basically include Peggy. She refuses to receive her. We'll just say include. But like, so when she came to join the group, like she basically, they closed the door on her. And Jackson was sensitive to this because his late wife had also had slander. They'd had to endure slander. Specifically, he didn't care what people said about him, and he straight up said that, I don't give a crap what people say about me. But he did not like that there was slander said against his wife. And so now you kind of had this situation where Eaton's wife, who, like I said, Aunt Jackson was friends with and made Secretary of War, was now being gossiped about. And the slight, though, was that they refused to include her in the wives group. So he demanded that members of the cabinet accept her into the circle. So Andrew Jackson demanded they accept her. And what happens is that Martin Van Buren makes a good choice. He befriends both the Eatons and includes Peggy. However, John Calhoun stuck by his wife and refused. This began the falling out from Jackson and the favor of Martin Van Buren, which essentially placed him as Jackson's successor rather than Calhoun. And so this falling out with Jackson does, I think, influence his kind of decision to then focus on trying to make a name. He loses some of that political clout when there's this fallout with Jackson. And so when the controversy of nullification creates a crisis in 1832, and then continues, Calhoun kind of like decides to stick his reputation on that. So what happens is in 1832, right, this nullification produced a crisis when South Carolina responded angrily to the tariff bill that offered them no relief from the 1828 tariff. So there was an 1832, we'll say the tariff bill of 1832. What they'd hoped, and why there hadn't been nullification yet, or attempts of it, was that the new tariff would eliminate the tariff of 1828. They called the tariff of 1828 the tariff of abomination. Okay, so what happens, right, is that the new tariff did not offer any relief on lowering, right, the taxes of it from 1828. That's what they'd hoped, right? And so with this, the South Carolina decides to they basically say that they're ready to secede. So they threaten to secede over this. And instead of seceding, Calhoun persuades them to, well, hey guys, instead of breaking from the government, right, we have this nullification idea in place, let's use it. So he persuaded them to use nullification instead. And what they did is that they had a state convention to nullify the tariff of 1828 and 1832. So they decided to nullify both. (1828) and 1832. And completely forbid the collection of duties within the state. So basically, right, they agree to they try out nullification. So Jackson's response to this is that he claimed, as soon as after they had the convention and this is what they came up with, he said that nullification was treason. So he had a very strong response to them actually enacting out nullification, and supporters were traitors, basically. So then he immediately, what he started doing is he began to strengthen and send in people to the federal forts in South Carolina, anticipating if there was going to be a war or attempted secession, that he be prepared to fight as necessary. And then Congress approved the Force Act, and that essentially was that he was allowed to use any force necessary to stop them from seceding, and really stop them from trying to enact nullification. It was more that it was any force necessary to stop secession, but it was tacked on to stopping nullification as well. So then Calhoun faced an issue with when he became what took his place in the Senate for South Carolina, because South Carolina was divided itself on nullification and secession. Luckily, I guess for Calhoun, he wasn't forced to act on whether they were going to secede or not, because Henry Clay comes in with a compromise. So you have Henry Clay's compromise, because it got really close to boiling down to what looked like it was going to be secession and a fight. And so Henry Clay said, okay, look, let's do this. The tariff will be gradually lowered until 1842. So it's not going to all at once, but they would slowly lower the tariff until 1942. And by 1942, it would be at the same level as the tariff of same level as it was in 1816. As it was in 1816. Those were that was passed. Jackson signed that. What's funny with this is that so South Carolina, in not only hearing of the Force Act, but then Henry Clay's compromise and that Jackson signed it, they then repealed the nullification and said, okay, we won't nullify it. But they also nullified, so then they repealed the nullification of the tariffs. But they also nullified the Force Act. So they weren't going to give up on this idea that they had a right to nullify things. Which they claimed was unconstitutional. So right, South Carolina, like, fine, okay, we'll agree to this. We'll repeal the nullification, even though technically the nullification was illegal. Nullification was a theory that John Calhoun had come up with, but it hadn't ever been tested if it was constitutional, and most agreed it was not constitutional. Andrew Jackson clearly believed it wasn't constitutional, as he called them traitors and treasonous. But they still went with, okay, well, we're going to repeal the nullification of the tariffs then. But then just to like prove a point, they nullified the Force Act. So they didn't ever fully say that they gave up the right to nullify, but they don't try it again. Not initially. What's super important with all this, like why the nullification crisis, besides it being interesting that you have a state try to be like, we get to choose what federal laws we follow and not, and the fact that it got close to South Carolina just suggesting they were, very seriously considering seceding if their nullification wasn't not approved but accepted, right? But the importance from this is what Calhoun and South Carolina, especially because South Carolina is going to be the problem later, is that South Carolina learned that no single state could defy the federal government. They didn't have the power to do so, right? They weren't going to be strong enough. They weren't going to have the manpower or the money or the support as an individual state to defy the federal government. And this would be remembered. So later, when you have the Confederate States, one of the things that South Carolina does, right, is they make sure to get other states to follow with them. And they did that because they remembered this lesson from the nullification crisis, that they wouldn't be able to be successful. So South Carolina was the instigator in this with the Confederate States and the secession. They very much were the driving force of getting it together. And so they learned from that the nullification crisis became a key kind of look at, if you're going to go up against the federal government, you've got to have multiple states in support of it. And if you don't, then you're not going to be successful. All right, we're going to look at the Indian Removal Act, although I'm going to show you the couple of pictures real quick before we move on to that. So we talked about the Dorr Rebellion. This was here, the adoption of the Constitution of Rhode Island, the People's Ticket, and this is the stuff they had people sign. I am an American citizen of the age of 21 years and have my permanent residence or home in this state. I am qualified to vote under the existing laws of the state. I vote for the Constitution formed by the Convention of the People assembled in province, which was proposed to the people. So this is for this is what they sent out to ratify, the new Constitution they created. These are just political cartoons about the nullification crisis. So, nullification crisis title about Jackson versus Calhoun, and there's the force bill backing up Jackson, who's for the federal, and then Calhoun for the states. And then you have this one, General Jackson slaying the many-headed monster, and the different heads are the states. Right, so this definitely was seen as a states versus federal control, and who would win. Again, the other states weren't involved, but this idea that the nullification crisis did bring into question the whole issue of states' rights again, and what the federal government should have. And it's ironic to a degree, right, that you have Andrew Jackson, who was pushing for more states' rights and less federal control, but then had to, because of nullification and the threat of secession, end up using having the Force Act behind him to have complete authority, complete federal authority to do whatever force was necessary to keep South Carolina in and not follow through with this, which is just the opposite of what he had initially proposed. Okay, so we're going to look at the Indian Removal Act next, as well as some of the sources with that. All right, with the Indian Removal Act, if we go back just for a second, kind of look at the different ways that our policies on Native Americans throughout the U.S., throughout time, up to this point. There were several different ways that the colonists first, and then the United States attempted to deal with Native Americans. When the colonists first came over, it largely was a void, right? It's kind of, we can't see them, then they're not there kind of thing. And that was easier to do, of course, when the colonists were relatively small in numbers. But as more and more people started coming over, this inevitably led to fighting. The void and fighting kind of coincided. So I have them as 1 and 2, but the reality is that the avoid and fight kind of went back and forth between those two. Out of sight, out of mind. Expand with colonists expanding, and then it leads to a conflict, and then an attempt to kind of avoid the issue, and then conflict again as they kept expanding and moving into Native American territory and taking it. Then you have a shift in thinking, which was to assimilate. And Thomas Jefferson was a proponent of this one. And this kind of goes to the belief that if they would just dress like Americans, or Europeans first, but then Americans, if they would just act like Americans, then they could assimilate into American society. Thomas Jefferson called them, what he called them as, noble savages, which in of itself is not, it's derogatory in of itself. But there's a difference with, like, the avoid and fighting was definitely a period of where it was just, well, they're savages. They're, uncivilized. And that works as the word too, especially when you look at the 5 tribes that the Indian Removal Act dealt with. They were called the 5 civilized tribes. So, so here it was the idea of, right, savages, the other being uncivilized, right? And then with noble savages as the term, it was the belief that they had inherent dignity. So the idea is that if just savage or uncivilized, then they don't have that. And because they had inherent dignity, this made civilized civilized society possible with Native Americans, right? That they could be civilized versus uncivilized. And the way that this then, because they had inherent dignity, and because that made civilization or being civilized possible, then all they had to do was assimilate into American culture. And if they did that, then they could, live and be part of that. So that was Thomas Jefferson's idea. And then you were going to have Andrew Jackson, which is he's going to go back to more the kind of savage or uncivilized belief that with this, assimilation is not possible. And Andrew Jackson was not in any way a friend or positive towards Native Americans. In fact, he had fought against Native Americans. He had killed Native Americans, and he believed that assimilation was not possible, that they could not coexist with not only Americans as a people, but also American laws. So if you don't believe that anymore, then the option is either to go back to fighting and killing or remove them. But there was some negative pushback against just outright murder. So his solution was that they should be removed. And the reason for wanting this, outside of whatever argument and justification is used for that, of course, was that the United States wanted their land. Right? So, I mean, it all goes back to resources and land. And that would be the idea of removal. The proponents of removal was based on this idea of, well, we don't have to then have these wars, and because the main groups that they were removing at the end with the Indian Removal Act were considered 5 civilized tribes, it was a little harder to justify outright just attacking them. Therefore, if we remove them, then they get their land, and they're kind of out of sight, out of mind again in that process. So that Andrew Jackson embarks on a policy of removing the remaining tribes in the area, which were called the 5 civilized tribes. And they were called the 5 civilized tribes because they had done the process of assimilation. The Cherokee the most, but all of them had adopted not only a lot of American laws. For example, the Cherokees, they had a constitution which was modeled after the United States Constitution. They practiced agricultural farming that modeled American standards. And so they're actually more closely tied to their land than semi-nomadic tribes that moved around, which had been an argument in the past to take land, was, well, that they're not using it, right? You have to improve land and use it to make ownership. And here they couldn't claim that. They had fenced off areas. They had farms. There was no justification to being like, well, they aren't using their land, so we can just take it. So they had to come up with a different kind of method. The tribes were the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. So these were the 5 tribes that they were looking that were part of the Indian Removal Act. Now, prior to this, there had been efforts to remove various tribes, and you had a combination of battles and removal that had already taken place. But these were the remaining tribes that lived in the southeast, right? And so the last kind of holdouts of a larger tribal land that people wanted, Americans wanted. So in 1830, see here, you had Congress approved the Removal Act. Now, the Removal Act, what it had in it, there was a series of things within the Removal Act. The first was that they would be given money for relocating west. Right, so they'd be paid money to move west, and then they would also be given money for any improvements on the land, so like housing, farming, that type of stuff. And then they would be given land in the West. It also, they would be given, and specific with this, which is important later, not to the time period we're going to get into, but the land in the West that they would be given, which this was used a lot, a perpetual title to. Right, so this is going to be your land forever, right? That had been claimed before, and it's not going to stop them later when you have the move to reservations and the Dawes Act. So later, so essentially the land in the West that they're going to move into, we'll look at a map in just a minute, was land that people kind of figured at the time, like, no one's going to want that. You know, that's out west. That's never going to be an issue. Sure, give them perpetual title because we aren't going to want it. And then you have an explosion of westward movement after the Civil War. Right before the Civil War, you have a significant amount of movement west actually going on before, and then a continued move west after the Civil War. And then it was like, oh, we do want that land, but we gave him perpetual title. That's okay. And so then the last one, number 5, right? If you were going to look here, just as far as what happens after the time period that our class is going to, is reservations and an attempt of the Dawes Act, which is going to look to Americanize and force Native Americans children to go to American English schools, kind of thing. But that's after our time period. But that's kind of the next thing. So they're not going to honor not surprisingly, the perpetual title, right? And then they would be given assistance for support and subsistence assistance. We'll say for support and setting up for 1 year. So they promised them, like, we're going to give you food, we're going to give you whatever you need in support for a year after you're removed. Okay, so this was what the Removal Act provided. And then Andrew Jackson went on a speaking tour to promote the Removal Act, because the best outcome would be that the various tribes would all sign this and agree. So he went on a speaking tour specifically to try to convince the Native Americans and the chiefs to accept the offer. And that's what we're going to look at. One of the readings here. This is one I put up on Canvas. So this one here shows his writing on the right. So let's look at this. I'm not going to look at the whole thing. We're just going to look at one part here, starting here. I beg of you to say to them that their interest, happiness, peace, and prosperity depend upon their removal beyond the jurisdiction of the laws of the state of Mississippi. These things have been oftentimes explained to them fully, and I forbear to repeat, but request that you make known to them that Congress, to enable them to remove and comfortably to arrange themselves in their new homes has made liberal appropriations, which will not be true because it gets diverted and pilfered. It was a measure I had much at heart and sought to effect because I was satisfied that the Indians could not possibly live under the laws of the states. Okay, so he's saying, please convince them to remove. It's for the best, right? And Congress has provided lots of funds, liberal funds for you. And I think this is needed because I don't think that the Native Americans could possibly live under the laws of the state. If now they shall refuse to accept the liberal terms offered, they only must be liable for whatever evils and difficulties may arise. I feel conscious of having done my duty to my red children. This is so paternalistic and condescending. So he saw them. And there's another quote I'm going to read you in just a second. Like he acted like that he was the father. He even calls himself their great father. And they're not adults. They're children, even though they're adults, right? He's saying that like they're like children. And if any failure of my good intention arises, it will be attributed to their want of duty to themselves, not to me. So, but this is a threat here, right? If they refuse to accept the liberal terms offered, they only must be liable for whatever evils and difficulties may arise. And he in his speech is right. So he claimed he was only looking out for their best interest, which was not true. And then besides, claiming he was only looking for their interest, he also made clear this idea that he said that they would have to follow if they did not move if they did not sign the Indian Removal Act treaty and move with the treaty, right? Then first they would have to follow and live under state laws. So basically they were taking away the tribal autonomy and agency and saying you'll no longer have any tribal agency. And then he said, he doesn't think they will be able to do that. And if they can't do that, in another one of his speeches, he says they will have to pay to leave. So essentially, if you don't sign now, you're not going to get the money. And any problems or consequences of staying are on them. Which, of course, leaves open, which will be part of the issue, with the states to abuse them and break the law and treat them however they want, and him being like, wash my hands of it. So here's the other quote. Their great father, so there's that great father part, right, is resolved that if they now refuse, he will trouble them no more, but leave them to remove or not as they please, and when they please, at their own expense. If they believe they can live under the laws of Mississippi, he is perfectly willing they should do so. But should they find they cannot and become desirous to seek a new home, let them understand they must seek it as they can and in their own way, for no other application will be made to that for a treaty. If they will not listen and be advised, be all consequences which may follow on them. Right? So you have this, right, threat of all of that, right? He claimed, so he did claim, and I guess we could put that there, right? That he claimed any tribe could refuse the offer, right? So the Indian Removal Act was supposed to be, this is what we're offering, but it wasn't supposed to be a forced removal. That it's what it's going to turn into for the Cherokee with the Trail of Tears. It's a forced removal. But at this point, he's claiming, look, here's what we're offering. Right, here's the list. We're offering money for relocating. We're offering money for improvements that you made on the land, such as building and farming and crops and whatever else. And then we're giving you land in the West in perpetual title and assistance for a year. And help relocating too. And if but that's not, you don't have to take it, right? Right, even says that if they, he will trouble them no more, but leave them to remove or not, as they please. But then it's at your own expense. So it's like, look, here's what Congress passed. This is what we're offering you. You can sign it now and get all of this stuff. And if you don't, that's perfectly fine. It's your choice, except for now you have to live under state laws. And, we're going to see in just a second, that's going to be a huge issue because the state isn't going to treat them fairly, obviously. And then he straight up says, I don't think you'll be able to do it. And then if you realize that you can't handle that, then you're going to have to pay for your own removal and any consequences, not my problem kind of thing. So it's not only like listing it, but it definitely was a threat too. And he warned the tribes that if they didn't listen to his fatherly advice, consequences would follow. So it very much was, like I said, this condescending, paternalistic thing that somehow he was the adult, the father, and the Native American tribes were children who, really should, they're not adults. You should listen to the father who's looking out for their best interest, which he also promoted over and over again. He was doing this because it was in the best interest for them. Some tribes that were smaller and really weren't, able to resist the pressures from federal government, but also the states, signed the Removal Act and moved west. The problem is that you had fraudulent, what were called Indian advisors who funneled the money into their own pockets. And very little of the money that was set aside actually went to aid the tribes in relocation. And this, so some of the tribes early on, like I said, signed this, and then what they found is that almost no money went to them. The journey to the West was not provided the funds they needed to make it. There were people who starved on their journey. This is not even the Trail of Tears. This is just the early people who agreed to sign the Removal Act and went, these tribes. And then when they made it to their location, the resources that they were supposed to be provided to build a new place and provide assistance for a year also didn't materialize. So the Cherokee, let's see. Let's put it here as a separate. The Cherokee Response. So the Cherokee saw this. The Cherokee were the largest of the tribes. As they, witnessed, they were already hesitant with agreeing to the Removal Act. And then when they saw with the Choctaws and Chickasaws and the disaster of when they moved west and the fact that they didn't get the resources, they decided to refuse the treaty. Okay, so they ultimately refused the treaty. And again, they were already hesitant about it, and then it just made it clear that they weren't going to be treated fairly, and all the promises of the Indian Removal Act clearly weren't happening with these other two tribes. Like I said, the Chickasaws and the Choctaw, they had signed the treaty early. I wanted to show the map here so you can see where you have the different groups. The blue are the Cherokee, right? So you have the Cherokee here, and this is where they were moving everyone. And there is another map that breaks down all the different locations. And of course, one of the arguments is that you're moving these tribes into this area in the West, but there was no regard for the land already being occupied or seen as territory of their Native Americans, and moving everyone into really close areas with a lot less land than what they had. I mean, you can see, right, this was it. It was a large amount of territory, which is why why the United States wanted it. All of that darker green area is the various tribes' territory, and they wanted that territory. And the Cherokee, like I said, are going to be they had one of the largest, but also the most powerful kind of group we'll see because of what they're able to do to resist, and even that isn't enough to hold out. But so all of this land is wanted for that's the reason they want the land. But they move them into much smaller areas within all the tribes into this territory. And the problem being is that there were other Native Americans who had various claims to that, which just of course is going to create more conflict and fighting, which the government doesn't care about. And that is going to be brought up by the Cherokee. So they refuse the treaty. What happens then is that Georgia, the state of Georgia, decides to try to, basically they're like, fine, then we're going to do what we want, because remember, they have to follow state laws. And so Georgia had already been somewhat hostile to them, because there had been gold found on their land, and Georgia was allowing people to just go into their land and do what they wanted with it. After they refused, they became even more increasingly hostile. They allowed Americans to they basically allowed squatters on their land. They basically encouraged, white Americans to go move into Cherokee territory and stay there. And the Cherokee are like, this is our property, you can't just live here. They also actively attacked them and persecuted them, tried to arrest them in order to, again, basically force them to move and make their life miserable in the process. So the Cherokee decided to fight this encroachment by the state of Georgia on their land by petitioning the Supreme Court. So they took it to the Supreme Court, right? So, and this is specifically against Georgia encroaching on their land and not respecting their property. And this court case was the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. There's two court cases that take place. The first one is against the state because of what we just talked about happening, right? And so it went to the Supreme Court to argue that the state couldn't encroach upon their land, and the end result, or the Supreme Court's decision, was that Indians were wards of the federal government, which again is this paternalism, right? Wards of the state, or it's usually how it's used, are wards. The word wards is usually used for children, right? So wards of the state, children who've been taken away from their parents because of abuse and other things like that, or orphans who don't have. So if you're a child and you don't have relatives that legally can either take care of you or just are not alive anymore, you become a ward of the state when you go into foster care. And that's where it's usually done. So to even say that they're wards of the federal government, it's very patronizing, because again, it's treating them as children, just like Andrew Jackson was. And it goes further, right? They're wards of the state, and in the decision, the write-up, they deserve paternal, which again is that father, right? Regard and protection. So it's again reinforcing when they mean by wards of the state that they're children. So they're wards of the state, federal government, not state, sorry. They're wards of the federal government, the wards of federalism, because I was talking about paternalism, federal government. There we go. And they deserve paternal regard and protection, but they lacked the standing as citizens, right? So they're not citizens of the United States that would allow the Supreme Court to protect their rights. So basically they're saying, well, you're not actual citizens of the United States, so you can't legally submit this to the Supreme Court. This actually is used in the Fugitive Slave Act, when you're going to there's going to be a case that with the Fugitive Slave Act where a former slave, well, actually still technically was a slave at the time, and they took it to the federal court, the Supreme Court, claiming that once a slave was brought into the North, then because that was a free state, then the slave was therefore free. And this was done in conjunction with abolitionists, and so they had the slave, he and his wife sued the Supreme Court, and petitioned the Supreme Court, I suppose, not sued the Supreme Court. They petitioned the Supreme Court, and they actually came back with the exact same argument. They expands beyond that, and again, we'll look at that, but it said, you're not a citizen, therefore, technically, this suit against to the Supreme Court isn't even valid. You have to be a citizen to be able to submit a valid Supreme Court case. So that's what they're saying here too. So that did not go well for them. What happens, of course, is that Georgia continues. I mean, that just became carte blanche for Georgia to continue disrespecting and abusing the Cherokee on their own land. So the next Supreme Court case, they sued again, and this time they had an American citizen sue Worcester v. Georgia on their behalf, because fine, so a citizen has to do it, and we're not considered American citizens, so we'll get an American citizen to sue on our behalf for Georgia. And then you had a ruling again, this time with a little bit different outcome. So this one said Indian nations are a distinct people. And they have the right to have a separate political identity. Then it said, because they are a distinct people with the right to maintain a separate political identity, they must be dealt with the federal government. So the benefit of this one was more positive, because one, it was claiming that the Native Americans were a distinct people that had their own political agency. So therefore, because they were a distinct people who have a separate political identity than American citizens, states, what it's saying when it's saying they must be dealt with the federal government, that's saying that the states, basically Georgia couldn't do what they were doing. Georgia had no authority over them. That of course blows Jackson's whole plan out of the water. Georgia or any state, right, has no authority over them. So according to this ruling, they don't have to follow state law because it's only with the federal government. It's like a foreign nation. States don't have rights over them, that you deal with the federal government. And so because they were a sovereign nation that had been long established by the United States, Georgia had no authority to encroach, to create legislation against the Cherokee. The federal government was going to be responsible for all their dealings. Well, Jackson's response to this, when he heard this, the Chief John Marshall, the Chief Justice, was John Marshall at the time. And so Jackson's response was, well, this is John Marshall has made his decision. Now, let's see him enforce it. Right, so basically, what Jackson is saying with that was that he was going to ignore the Supreme Court ruling. So even when they won in court, they didn't win because the president just said, doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, how is John Marshall going to enforce that ruling? Because I'm not going to support it. And since he isn't going to support it, it didn't matter that they won the Supreme Court case and should have been able to stay, and Georgia had no authority to encroach on their land, to make legislation against them, to make laws against them, to arrest them, because the president wasn't going to uphold, and then the police or whoever else no one was going to uphold the Supreme Court decision, because Andrew Jackson straight up said, good luck, enforcing that, because I'm not going to make that happen. And so this ultimately split the Cherokee. I'm going to read, I did forget to read, let's see, where I'm 4, one of their appeals in just a second, but I'm going to throw this up. So this ends up splitting the Cherokee. You have a minority in 1835, a minority of Cherokee, after realizing and hearing that Jackson wasn't going to enforce the Supreme Court ruling. Oh, that was weird. Okay. Felt their only option was to sign a treaty and try to get some money and support from it, in order to get the original assistance that was offered the tribes. The Treaty of New Akota, what it did is it gave, it ceded Cherokee land to Georgia, and for $4.5 million. And then it also had land west of Mississippi. And they said they would pay the cost of relocation. So the problem with this is that the majority of the Cherokee tribe, right, this was a minority. The majority of the Cherokee tribe did not agree with the treaty, and the chief of the Cherokee didn't sign or participate in this. But they didn't care because they're going to use the Treaty of New Akota as the justification for forced removal with the Trail of Tears. They're not going to matter that they're like, well, this was not signed in good faith. Right? It's like, no, we have a treaty. You signed it. So the majority still refused to leave and claimed that it was an illegal, that it was completely illegal, which it technically was. Those that did sign agreed to leave. So some left, but there, like I said, the majority were still there, and they completely just found, basically it was like, find some Cherokee who will agree to sign this, and then we can claim that we have a legal treaty, and so we have a legal justification to forcibly remove them off their land. So the one other reading, this is from Voices of Freedom, but I just found it online to show you the part on it. So we're just going to look at starting here, right? So this is in Voices of Freedom, right? We wish to remain on the lands of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to claim without interruption or molestation. The treaties with us and the laws of the United States made in pursuance of treaties guarantee our residence and our privileges and secure us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties be fulfilled and these laws executed. Right? So they're specifically referring back to, like, not only do we have an original claim and right to this land, but we have treaties with you guys that show that this is our land and that you can't take it. But if we are compelled to leave our country, we see nothing but ruin before us. Oh, I skipped a part, so we'll come back to that. Let's start up here. Sorry. Up here is where I wanted to start. We are aware that some persons suppose it will be for our advantage to remove beyond Mississippi. We think otherwise. Our people universally think otherwise. Thinking that it would be fatal to their interest, they have almost to a man sent their memorial to Congress deprecating the necessity of a removal. This question was distinctly before their minds when they signed their memorial. Not an adult person can be found who has not an opinion on the subject, and if the people were to understand distinctly that they could be protected against the laws of their neighboring states, there's probably not an adult person in the nation who would think it best to remove. So that's one of the things that they are calling at it, right? That if they could be protected against the laws of neighboring states, there is not an adult person in the nation who would think it's best to remove. And so they're calling out, like, we're being attacked by Georgia. That's if that wasn't happening at all, no one would be like, yay, we want to move, right? That's not fair that we're being attacked, and we're aware that people think it'd be best for our removal. We disagree. There are doubtless many who would flee to an unknown country, however, beset with dangers and sufferings, rather than be sentenced to spend 6 years in a Georgia prison for advising one of their neighbors not to betray his country, which was one of the things. They arrested and threw Cherokee into prison for pushing back against it. They also arrested some white people that were helping the Cherokee and trying to tell the people that were just squatting on their land that they had no right to do so. And there are others who could not think of living as outlaws in their native land, exposed to numberless vexations and excluded from being parties of witness in a court of justice. It is incredible that Georgia should have ever enacted the oppressive laws to which reference is here made, unless she had supposed that something extremely terrific in its character was necessary in order to make the Cherokee willing to remove. So they're saying, right, Georgia only created these laws because they knew an extreme measure was needed to get them to move, right? So they're calling that out. You can claim that, we want to move, but clearly Georgia just made these crazy extreme laws because it was the only way to force us out, right? If we wanted to remove, or if removal was the best for us, then these laws wouldn't have been needed to make. They made these laws to make it difficult to live here in our own land that we have right to, not only by just the fact that we have been here, but because of treaty. And yet they had to create some extreme conditions to force us out. Right, but because we cannot endure. So if there are people wanting to remove, right, and so this is arguing, of course, later, those who did decide to remove, it was because we cannot endure to be deprived of our national and individual rights and subjected to a process of intolerable opposition. So basically, like, you guys intentionally created this horrible situation to make it unbearable to live here. So then we wish to remain on the land of our fathers. We have original right. So, but if we are compelled to leave our country, we see nothing but ruin before us. The country west of the Arkansas Territory is unknown to us. From what we can learn of it, we have no prepossessions in its favor. All the inviting parts of it, as we believe, are preoccupied by various Indian nations to which it has become assigned. They would regard us as intruders and look upon us with an evil eye. And then they talk about how the other part doesn't have wood or water and no one can actually live as a farmer there. So then they point out, right, look, and then you're putting us in a territory where any of the parts that are really livable, there are already Native Americans there. And on top of that, the other area that they're wanting to move us, there's no wood, water, and no Indian tribe can live as agriculturists with these articles. And this is the type of stuff that the Cherokee put out. They put out petitions. They put out proposals, they put out appeals, they went to court, they followed all of American laws and practices. I mean, if you're looking at this idea of assimilation, even when they followed all of the rules and structures of the United States, it didn't matter, right? Because ultimately, no one, not everyone, but the majority of Americans didn't see Native Americans. Not only were they not citizens, but they didn't really see them as adults or people. That it was more that we want your land, so we're going to remove you one way or another. So how the Trail of Tears comes about. So you have some Cherokee that signed off on the treaty, but a majority, along with the chief, who refused and refused to leave after the treaty had been signed, and those who had agreed relocated and were given money. So the Trail of Tears didn't happen under Andrew Jackson. The Indian Removal Act and all of what we talked about so far did. Trail of Tears happened with Martin Van Buren. So when Martin Van Buren came into office, he sent an army to forcibly remove them. And the army was intentionally sent midday so that it was to surprise them. So ideally that they wouldn't be at home at their house. The goal was that anyone they found, right, men, women, children, they were all grabbed when they found them and forced into a waiting area. And then what they did is they burned their homes, their farms, and possessions. That way, the belief being that there was no incentive for them to fight. So the army burned land, farms, homes, etc., with the idea that nothing left to fight for, as they sat there and watched everything be destroyed. And then around 1,000 were able to flee to North Carolina, and the federal government actually eventually provided reservations there. but the rest were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. So they took away all their possessions. So they had virtually nothing to take with them when forcibly marched west. And why it's kind of called the Trail of Tears is that many died from harsh conditions, lack of good food, clothing, water, on the march to new land. And then on top of that, once they of course got to their new reservation, the new reservation was lacking food, supplies, just like the earlier tribes that removed willingly. They still were not given enough of food and supplies. Like, nothing was learned from that of like, we need to at least make sure that they have enough food and supplies. Nope, none of that was done. So you ended up having harsh and desolate conditions with even more deaths once arrived. And thus it became known as the Trail of Tears. So that's where we're going to end for this. Of course, with this, like I said, you end up, then the U.S. takes their land. But ultimately the location and land that they were given with new perpetual title and moved to the west doesn't stay that way. As westward expansion continues, that land is then going to be desired as well. And their land is going to be given away in the land rush, in the Oklahoma land rush. The government is going to take Cherokee land away again and give it away for free to settlers that agree to move west. And then other settlers are just going to move and fight and kill Native Americans as they come across them. There's also going to be systematic attempts to end various tribes outside of the original 5 civilized tribes in the West, such as the Sioux, where the army is sent on the railroads to hunt and kill as many of the buffalo as they can. The Sioux not only relied on the buffalo for food, but it was also connected to their religious and social identity. And all aspects of the buffalo were incorporated into clothing, into shelter, and to religious beliefs, along with food. And so the army systematically went and slaughtered as much of the bison as they could, so that it weakened the Sioux, demoralized them, and made it easier to not only attack and kill them, but ultimately force them into smaller reservations, and then ultimately, with the Dawes Act, attempt to assimilate again. But it was a different assimilation. The assimilation with like Thomas Jefferson was that the Native Americans would still live on their land, but would act like Americans. The Dawes Act was a new method of take away as much of their land as possible, get them to move out of the reservations, give them a individual plot of land so that they no longer, and then Americanize them, so they no longer identify with the tribe, they don't live as a tribe, essentially erase all of their identity altogether and force them to live on individual plots of land, not next to each other. And then, that they'll raise their children with English without, so they were the Dawes Act and the subsequent, like, so the slaughter of the bison, of the whole attempt of the second wave of westward movement and removing them from the reservations was to eliminate reservations altogether, or eliminate and eradicate all Native American culture. That was the ultimate goal. So assimilation didn't necessarily remove all culture. that under Thomas Jefferson, it was more like just assimilate and act like Americans and do these things and you'll be accepted into society. But, you know, if you're still living on your tribe, you still have your language. Those things are acceptable as long as you also know English and dress like Americans and do all these other things. The later movement is not only, so you have all of this forced removal and poor treatment, and then you do it again, but this time you systematically try to wipe out everything about the culture altogether. So this isn't done, right? This was like one step, and then there's going to be more as westward expansion continues. All right, we're going to look at, the next lecture is going to be looking at slavery and the Southern Plantation Society.